Hello and welcome, everyone. My name is Daryl Varga. I'm the president of the Film Studies Association of Canada. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2017 Film Studies Martin Walsh Memorial Lecture. Thank you for being here. Miigwech. I'd like to begin by acknowledging with humility the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege to gather. Toronto is in the dish with one spoon territory. The dish with one spoon is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. Subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and all newcomers, have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. The dish, or sometimes called the bowl, represents what is now southern Ontario, from the Great Lakes to Quebec, and from Lake Simcoe into the United States. We all eat out of the dish, all of us that share this territory, with only one spoon. That means we have to share the responsibility of ensuring the dish is never empty, which includes taking care of the land and the creatures we share it. This was a treaty made between the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee after the French and Indian War. Newcomers were then incorporated into it over the years, notably in 1764 with the Royal Proclamation, the Treaty of Niagara. More recently, settlers have acted in shameful ways on this territory, and it is our job, all of us, to do better. And I include myself in this. We are scholars of the moving image and need to know that real people live in these spaces behind these images. So welcome here today. The Martin Walsh Lecture is the keynote event of our annual conference. Martin Walsh was the first president of what was then the Ontario Film Studies Association, the precursor to the national entity, founded in 1976. Martin died in a cycling accident in 1977, and since '78, this lecture has taken his name to honor his life and work. It's my pleasure on behalf of the association to introduce our speaker today, Jesse Wente. Jesse is an Anishinaabe broadcaster, curator, film programmer with the Toronto International Film Festival Group, and also, and perhaps foremost, an outspoken activist. The title of Jesse's talk, Neese Titeka, The 7 Generations of Indigenous Cinema. We'll welcome Jesse, and then we'll have the talk with time for Q&A at the end. So, welcome, Jesse.
Thank you all. I love Daryl to lead off any evening with a little treaty history. I think that's good for all of us to remember. I gotta be honest, this is a bit of an intimidating room. The only talk, I give lots of talks these days, the only talk where the audience judgment concerned me more was with my daughter's 5th grade class. They were very intimidating. It's tough to hold their attention. But so I'm going to talk a little bit about Indigenous cinema today, and by that I mean Indigenous-made cinema, not the cinema about Indigenous people, which, as I'm sure all of you know, dates back to the very origins of the moving image here on Turtle Island. But I assume most of you already know, your John Fords and your history around that sort of representation. So, and I hope most of you will know actually the history I'm going to talk about today, because that would be reassuring that everyone is clued into or is teaching the history of Indigenous cinema as we go. So we'll start there, and then as I'll run through that, it's tight for time, so I won't do any major in-depth discussions of any of the specific films. Maybe we can get to that afterwards, and I'll get to the good stuff once we get through the history here. So to start, it is important to acknowledge that there were Indigenous filmmakers making movies in the silent era in North America. Probably among the most prominent were Princess Redwing, who's pictured here. Her real name was Lillian St. Cyr. She was an Nanticoke woman. She made films with W.D. Griffith, among many of the other prominent silent filmmakers of the time. She also made films, most notably with her husband, James Youngdeer, who was a Winnebago man, who she met and this is a key part of this history. She met at the Carlisle Indian School, which was the most prominent and largest residential school in the US. They had their own residential school history. Carlisle School was established in 1882. It was the celebrity in residential school. Jim Thorpe, the prominent football player, also attended there, as well as a number of the performers that would go on to star in the Wild West shows and the early silent films. Young Deer ran the Pathé Company's West Coast studio in the pre-Hollywood area. He made more than 100 silent films during his time with Pathé. The vast majority of these are now lost, are considered lost films. Several of them, Indian Raid, do exist if you ever want to explore them. The George Eastman House in upstate New York has a lot of those films. They tended to make movies very much in the style of contemporary representation of Indigenous people. So they made westerns, one-reel westerns, tended to be cowboy and Indian pictures. They did invert the narratives often. So for example, interracial romance was usually the solution to the conflict as opposed to the cause in their films. So they did invert that a little bit, but largely in keeping with sort of what was the general silent output of westerns, westerns being the most dominant genre of the silent era. And so they were very much in keeping to that. Now, the Indigenous cinema that I'm really going to talk about today is not this, because these were really outliers in the history of the moving image. And there was, after they finished making their films, there would be many decades where there wouldn't be Indigenous filmmakers, both on Turtle Island, but as well as the centers of Indigenous filmmaking, which is Turtle Island as well as New Zealand and Australia, or Eritrea. So the Indigenous cinema I'm going to talk about actually starts in the late 60s and early 70s, a time when First Nations people all over the world were beginning to assert their rights more forcefully, sometimes through the use of force, and certainly through protests similar to the ones mounted during the American Civil Rights Movement. These events shifted the popular discourse around First Nations for the first time in roughly 100 years. It was accompanied by an opening of some cinematic doors to Indigenous artists who were very much inspired to take up the camera due to the events and their surroundings in their communities. So in Canada, we had the Indian Film Unit at the National Film Board. This started in the late 60s. Important to keep in mind that this started within the decade after First Nations achieved and were legally allowed to vote federally. So Keita always will sometimes check back in always my talks about what was the actual policy going on. So key to remember that Indigenous cinema, as we're going to talk about it today, didn't start until that specific event occurred, which happened in 1960. Wouldn't happen in Quebec, by the way, for provincial elections until 1969. So to give you an idea. For the Indian Film Unit and the Challenge for Change program, who started training First Nations filmmakers and produced really the first Indigenous-made films here in Canada, including landmarks like You Are on Indian Land, the Mike Mitchell film. Many of these were actually miscredited at the time. The NFB has since done great work in resolving those issues. The credits would have gone to the white directors at the time. If you've seen these films, they're all infinitely available online. You'll find one of the key aesthetics to Indigenous cinema right away, which is the movies are activist-based documentaries to start with, and still very much to today, this is a main theme for Indigenous cinema. This is because the artists were now given access to filmmaking materials. Most of the artists were activists first. And as we go through, including the woman we're seeing here, they started really as activists for their communities, and their films as an outgrowth of their activism. So the NFB would launch with the Indian Film Unit. The key figure that would come along simultaneously, of course, is Neese, the Abenaki filmmaker and storyteller, who started out as a singer and a storyteller. Her first films with the National Film Board are actually those old classroom films that you would record that flip over the tape if you remember, when it would beep. Somewhere those you can find those. Those were the first films she produced, these educational films for the NFB, until she made Christmas at Moose Factory, which we can see some images. There we go. Christmas at Moose Factory. I think she's just finished her 48th film in her 50 years of filmmaking. So Neese was indeed an activist and a storyteller before she ever came to filmmaking. And we need to jump forward from her initial film, Christmas at Moose Factory, and go to her later films, which would be Incident at Restigouche as probably the most key film to start with. And it's because it's through that film that she met Merita. Now, one of the interesting things with Indigenous film is that it's a global phenomenon. It doesn't just occur on Turtle Island, although Turtle Island filmmakers were instrumental, especially Neese and those early NFB filmmakers, in helping to launch what would be the aesthetic that would be really adopted worldwide. But a lot of things happened all at the same time to really grow Indigenous cinema worldwide. So in New Zealand, you have Merita Mita, who's again an activist, and she starts making documentaries in the late 70s and early 80s, particularly a film called Bastion Point, Day 507, which in relation to Incident at Restigouche, they shared very common themes. They were about a land dispute, they were about a physical clash with the government, with the police, and they were voiced and directed by Indigenous women active in the space and activists. So you have a simultaneous development of basically the exact same movie made on opposite ends of the world at the exact same time about the Indigenous people facing the exact same thing, which is a political reawakening after 150 years of colonial rule. So by the late 60s, you have Indigenous people beginning to become politically active. You have the American Indian movement, AIM in the States. And you start to see our voice begin to take shape. And it isn't until the early 80s that the activist documentaries really begin. So we have Merita, as we can see, talking there about Bastion Point. And at the same time that we have Merita in 1978 in Australia, we have this woman whose name is Essie Coffey. She directed a film called My Survival as an Aboriginal in 1978. Again, if you watch this film side by side with both Merita's films and Neese's, you'll find remarkable similarities. Indigenous women voicing, and I'll keep saying voice is very important for this work, because again, imagine Indigenous people are arriving at moving image as something that they control relatively. This is the birth of it. So this is early on, and we're still very much in oral culture, and we can talk a little bit about Neese's process and how it's driven by voice, and how her auteur stamp is really one of voice as opposed to visual motifs. But in Essie's, she takes you to her community. It's a remarkable film. She takes your community and actually presents you the current situation of what is going on in her community, which is issues around land, resource development, interactions with law, the justice legal system. I won't say justice system, I'll say the legal system. Not so justice when it comes to Indigenous people. It is legal though. So exact same activist films. Essie was very much an activist before she ever started getting filmed. So we're very early on, we see the main aesthetic. Activist driven, voice over. It's key that I mention this because for most of these filmmakers, having their own voice in the film was a real challenge. The producers didn't want them to do the voiceover. Neese would happily tell you the story herself, where they didn't want her to be the voiceover, the voice you heard in Incident at Restigouche, nor did they actually want her conducting the interviews with ministers and political officials. Both Merita and Essie faced the exact same issues in the making of their films. They all fought through it to have their voice. And of course with Neese, her movies do start with sound. She takes a sound recorder into the community first, before she ever brings cameras. So we have these three women simultaneously making movies at virtually the exact same time. They would encounter each other on the International Film Festival circuit. Film festivals play a vital and integral role to the expansion of Indigenous cinema. That is where the artists met each other, shared their work, were able to communicate with one another, because these are all filmmakers working outside of the large commercial industry. So there isn't really venues for this work to be seen internationally outside of the festival circuit. And indeed, it was in 1984 at a film festival in Guelph, a documentary festival in Guelph, that Merida would meet Neese for the first time. They would become lifelong friends and warriors, and would communicate often. Merida, as we'll discuss, abandoned documentaries for narrative features very early on. Neese is still making her films. So, key to remember who the founders of Indigenous cinema are, Indigenous women, and that they all started at virtually the same time. Another key in Australia is the founding of CAMA. This is the Central Australian Aboriginal Media Association. This is founded in 1982 in Alice Springs, which is quite a remote Indigenous community in the middle of the desert in Australia. Really key is that this was Indigenous-led media. They started with radio. They still have the largest Aboriginal radio network in all of Australia, but they also produced television and ultimately film. And many of the Australian filmmakers that I'll reference here today came out of CAMA. They started their work at CAMA. And I point this out because, as I'll get to at the end, the relationship between how movies are funded in all of these regions and how we now discuss Indigenous cinema are very much interrelated and key for us moving forward. I don't know if you guys usually in academia discuss the funding of these movies, but the very nature of Indigenous cinema, be that it's inherently political, and that the funding is typically public, presents an interesting challenge in terms of the development of the cinema beyond its origins. So CAMA started in 1982, and out of CAMA you get filmmakers like Rachel Perkins, Warwick Thornton, Ivan Sen, really an entire generation of Indigenous films. Here's an image from Neese's film Incident at Restigouche. And then Ganasatake, 270 Years of Resistance. Now I think it's key to understand about these early documentaries, couple of driving factors and other things that ultimately define Indigenous cinema. So not only the activist base, not only the documentary, they're inherently tied to community. And this is really important for understanding all of Indigenous cinema, is that tie to community presents itself in any number of ways. It presents itself in the method that Neese approaches her film work, which is to enter the community with a recorder first, usually 6 months before she ever comes in with a camera, to gain the trust. And much of that, of course, is the result of the way Indigenous people were traditionally filmed, which was not in that method. It was including at the National Film Board, where it was much more of a drop-in and an extraction of stories as opposed to the community itself being in charge of what it relates. And that's what Neese really does. But also that these films stand in very much counter contrast to mainstream media. And they serve a purpose beyond one that is purely cinematic, and which is why documentary was such a popular and, in fact, I would say necessary form for these artists to tackle first, which is the topics that they discuss were not ones presented in an Indigenous perspective in mainstream media at the time. So if you went to New Zealand in the early 80s and you saw the Bastion Point standoff, you would have, in the New Zealand media, in the Pakeha media, you would have had a much different viewpoint, much like the CBC and the broadcasters at the time were interested in a much different perspective on Ganasatake and the Oka crisis than the one Neese ultimately presented in her film, which was not released until 3 years after the crisis. But now, sitting in 2017, I would say that film is instrumental in how we actually understand what happened there, in a way that journalism was going to fail us in the absence of these filmmakers. So when we're discussing the development of the cinema, they do take on a journalistic perspective, largely to fill a gap existing in current journalistic practice, one that recent events might suggest continues unabated to this day. But that these were I sometimes like to refer to this era of Indigenous filmmaking, this generation, and I won't get to all 7 because we're not there yet, Daryl. The title is a bit of a lie. We're like 3rd generation. Again, I always like to look forward, but in this particular generation, they were absolutely trying to correct political wrongs, urgent political wrongs, and I often call this the cinema of necessity. These were movies that had to be made because the issues present in them were urgent to our survival here, and that if not given this voice, it would be hard to imagine the gains that we have made since these movies were produced. It's actually hard to imagine us making them. That's how necessary these films ultimately were, and also suggests the burden and the obligation that these filmmakers felt to their community and the obligation to tell these stories. Bastard Point, Merita literally grabbed a camera from the offices and ran out to film it in the street as it was happening. Neese ditto with Incident Restitution, and especially on Ganasatake. So it was, these films are, we can't separate the aesthetic of these films from the current events that helped to create them and the current events around which the filmmakers were born into. So, that's, the documentary was the prevalent means of Indigenous, oh there she is, so fabulous. Indigenous expression, and still to this day, that in Canada, that's still the primary cinema that's produced largely out of the NFB still, is documentary for Indigenous filmmakers, and again, we'll get to why that is later. Now, Merita moved on rather quickly. She found documentary filmmaking and the activist stance of those films to be really difficult. So she chose to start expressing those stories in narrative films. She made the first feature-length film narrative feature-length film directed by an Indigenous woman called Maori, which she made with her husband Barry Barclay, who was also an Indigenous man who made a film called Ngati, which was actually the first Indigenous feature film presented. Ngati's an interesting film in that, like so much of Indigenous cinema, it touches on the themes of land, identity, and the clash between modernity and tradition. These are common themes throughout all of Indigenous cinema, both documentary and narrative, and very easy to understand why. These are pressing concerns for us today, all of those themes, and very political, and we can discuss how they get politicized. So there you see some images from there. In Australia, Tracy Moffett, who's primarily a photographer and a visual artist, she actually just had a show at the Venice Biennale just recently. She was one of the highlighted artists there. In the early 90s, she started to experiment with form in film. She made a film called Bedevil, which is 3 Aboriginal ghost stories told in one feature-length film. You begin to see the adoption or the adaptation of the activist cinema into a more narrative form. She also enjoyed having sort of Brechtian influences. Her sets were very overt. The acting sometimes very overt. This particular film, Night Cries, was in response to Jetta, which is perhaps the most famous Australian film about Indigenous people. It's their, how would I put it, their Nanook sort of idea. This is her response to that, about an Aboriginal woman who cares for an infirm white woman. Again, foreshadowing sort of more direct cinema influences, more narrative cinema influences. And we begin here, and I'll strike this, in Australia and New Zealand, we begin here to break away from the documentary tradition as more and more narrative filmmakers start to make films. So we have Rachel Perkins making a film like Radiance. You'll notice a lot of Indigenous women in these directors' lists. I think that's one of the true strengths of Indigenous cinema, is that it is far more representative, far more female representation in Indigenous cinema than you'll see in cinema broadly. In the States, we had Chris Ayers' Smoke Signals, which was the first Indigenous feature-length film really made in the modern era, contemporary era in the US. It starred an entirely Canadian cast. largely because Canada has a long history of Indigenous theatre, so we had the best trained actors on Turtle Island, and they were often used in American productions. It's a comedy and a road movie, so you begin to see from the States where, due to the lack of public funding, the making of Indigenous feature-length films tends to be quite difficult. And this was the only one really made in the 1990s. But it still adheres to some of the core principles of Indigenous cinema. It is community-based. It is political. And we can talk about how all of these films are inherently political, because being Indigenous is inherently political on Turtle Island these days. No fault of our own. And it's connected to the depiction of contemporary Indigenous existence. This is one of the interesting things about Indigenous cinema and why activist documentaries were also adherents. We have to remember that mainstream cinema's representation of Indigenous people is by a very wide margin historical in its presentation. So when you look at the Westerns, and you look at most non-Indigenous filmmakers making Indigenous stories, they place Indigenous people in the past as part of the, really out of the necessity of what Manifest Destiny requires, which is the erasure and elimination or extinction of Indigenous people. So you often see in the overculture's depiction of Indigenous stories, Indigenous people placed in the past. This is why, for example, in the Nook, while the Innu were contemporary at the time of the making of the film, and the film was ultimately presented as a documentary to the wider public, they hunted with spears in the film as opposed to rifles, which would have been commonplace at the time. It's why in the Edward Curtis film In the Land of the Henhunters, which was made in 1914, the Indigenous nations, the men had wore wigs, long wigs, because at that time the men had all shorn their hair. But Curtis wanted a not contemporary depiction of Indigenous people, he wanted the past. Indigenous artists have largely been unconcerned with the past unless it's directly related to their contemporary way of life. So most of their activist films are not about, they will contextualize, they will use history to contextualize a present day situation, but they're about what's happening to us now. Indigenous artists, first and foremost, are concerned with contemporary Indigenous life, which runs counter to the cinema of representation of most of Hollywood, and by its very existence declares that we are still here and thus not actually erased. And so Smoke Signals is very much the same sort of idea. This is a contemporary depiction of Indigenous people. So we jump forward to 2001 with the release of Adenarjuat the Fast Runner. This is the first feature-length film from Asuma. Now Asuma, interestingly, because I said, if you'll remember I said coincidences, they started in 1983 too. So if you'll notice, all of this happened right around the same time in the early 1980s. So Zach Canuck, who was primarily a sculptor and an artist before he ever took up a video camera, famously traded one of his sculptures to get his first video camera in 1983, started Asuma Productions in Igloolik in Nunavut. He also started, along with Norm Cohen, they largely started making what I would call docudramas as opposed to documentaries. They are factually based, but involve recreation as much as they do chronicling of actual events. And this starts very early. And their main goal was to chronicle Inuit life for future generations and to chronicle the stories of the elders for the future generations so they wouldn't actually be lost. When we arrive at Adenarjuat, so we're now almost 20 years into their life as a company and as artists, they apply the same technique to a very famous Inuit story, a legend, some would say, but it's both true and legend in many ways. There's people that exist that are related to the people in the film. But he adheres or maintains the key parts of Indigenous cinema. His films are among the most community-based productions you'll see in film. He activates the entire community to make his movies. He relies on largely non-professional actors. He's telling stories in Inuktitut to Inuit. He's recreating their legends for them. And cultural practice in a way that actually reclaims traditional practice. So in Zach's feature films, and he's now made 3 of them, including Mullah, or The Searchers, which is his remake of the John Ford film, which was released just earlier this year. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But for example, for Adenarjuat and Journals of Knut Rasmussen, all of the clothing is made in exactly the way it would have been made at the time the film is set. The story I like to tell, for example, in Journals, the seal oil lamps are the traditional seal oil lamps. Now, filmmakers, of course, have been doing this for years. I remember Kubrick famously had 3 wick candles devised in order for him to be able to shoot by candlelight for Barry Lyndon. Zach is doing something similar, but you have to remember Kubrick was making his purely for cinematic aesthetic and for the style of film. Zach is doing it so that the knowledge based in those practices are not lost for future generations. So this is an act of actual cultural survival, the production of his films, because they connect the community back to their traditional practices while making a traditional story that can be exhibited in film. So we have Adenarjuat, which is really what I would call the next generation of Indigenous cinema, or the Indigenous New Wave. It won a major prize at the Cannes Film Festival, which is important just because that, I think, inspired and helped expand its reach. And we saw numerous narrative features around the world come after Adenarjuat that used many of its same techniques. We had Samson and Delilah. This is Warwick Thornton's incredible film, also won a major prize at the Cannes Film Festival. Like Adenarjuat uses non-professional actors, is very naturalistic in its setting and tone, and relates history to contemporary Indigenous life in Australia. You have Tumala. This is Ivan Sen's film set in a Indigenous community. Again, non-professional actors, community-based. The community came together to make the film naturalistic in its presentation. Then you have Boy. This is the film from Taika Waititi. Taika is a Maori filmmaker from New Zealand. This is his first international success. Boy, all about a young boy and his somewhat estranged/strange father, played by Taika in the film. And again, we're still adhering to community-based, political, and about contemporary existence. All of the films tend to relate right back to this. These are central concerns to ongoing Indigenous existence. In the States, we have the development of filmmakers like Sterling Harjo, who made 4 Sheets to the Wind. Again, a very community-based film. He also made Barking Water, and I would perhaps most draw you to Miko, his last film, which I showed at the Toronto International Film Festival a couple years ago. This was set on the streets in Oklahoma among the Indigenous homeless community, again using a wide cast of non-professionals to make a community-based, activist-driven narrative feature that used and started to infuse Indigenous storytelling and legends. This is also partially a ghost story. And I think with Fast Runner, one of the key elements to that is not only is it a docudrama, in that it's a recreation of an event that actually happened, but you begin to start infusing Indigenous storytelling or Innu storytelling into that film. The example I most commonly use is that the film does not delineate between characters who are spirit and who are living. So you can be watching a scene with a character that is dead, technically, but does not appear. There is no indicator to the audience, as most Western filmmakers would, that you've somehow entered a dreamscape, because this is not a dreamscape for the Innu. The spirits live alongside. This is true of many Indigenous people, but in their practice, that it would be very common to have a conversation with the spirit at the same time that you're having dinner with everyone else. This is an image from The Searchers, or Mullah, Zach's most recent film, which I think is what brings us to the sort of more modern and contemporary evolution of what we're seeing with the cinema. So the adoption of really more formal Indigenous storytelling techniques, which we saw beginning with Tracy Moffett in the 90s and really extend through Zach Canuck's work in the 2000s. What we're seeing now among Indigenous filmmakers is an embrace of genre, and I'm talking classic traditional cinematic genre. So Zach has made what at one time would have been called a Western, except it's a Northern, I guess, and entirely from the Indigenous perspective. Absolutely stunning film, highly recommended. You also have films like Brand New Day. This is a film by Rachel Perkins, which is a musical set in residential schools in Australia. So you begin to have a adoption of, again, traditional cinematic genre. Because what you have with the filmmakers, we have to remember when Alanis, Merita, Essie, and even Zach started filmmaking in the early 80s, there was no Indigenous cinema for them to draw. They were inventing it. What we have with the current generation of filmmakers is a generation that has grown up with Indigenous cinema being in existence and having a canon to draw from while also drawing from the larger cinematic canon, because they all watched musicals and Blade Runner. This is The Deadlands. This is a film made by Toa Fraser, who's a Fijian, set entirely pre-contact in Eritrea among the Maori. It's a martial arts film that was shown at TIFF a few years ago. It similarly to Zach's films, is a community-based and required some traditional recreation. So the martial art that's present is not actually practiced currently by the Maori as a combat sport. It's a ceremonial exhibition. However, the actors actually had to relearn how to properly use the weapons. They had to relearn the use of the haka in an actual combat setting, as opposed to what it is now, which is largely, it's a traditional greeting or performed in ceremony. Here, as opposed to actual combat, here they actually had to learn how to use it in combat. So again, you have an Indigenous film, and it's entirely pre-contact. So it has no narrative that involves colonialism, as it's entirely removed from that structure. So you have, and then here's Ivan Sen, who made a film like Mullah, again, very much the sort of activist-based, community-based storytelling that we had seen, now making basically a police procedural in the outback called Mystery Road. He's made 2 of these films now. They've been big hits in Australia, sort of outback noirs in a way. Alaskan filmmaker named Andrew McLean made a northern noir called On the Ice, which is fantastic, about a murder in an Alaskan Indigenous community. Here in Canada, you have someone like Jeff Barnaby, who's always played with genre in his short films, typically horror films. Made a crime, basically a res-based crime film called Rhymes for Young Ghouls. And then to circle back to Taika, Taika, of course, made a vampire movie called What We Do in the Shadows, which is very popular. But many people won't even know that it was a Maori film, but it is. I should also say that Taika, his next film is also a genre work called Thor. So I'm very excited to welcome that into the canon of Indigenous cinema once that comes out. So what you have, though, is a real shift in terms of what we've seen in terms of production. So we've gone from activist-driven, community, issue-based documentaries through an experimentation infusing narrative forms, traditional narrative structures, as well as Indigenous storytelling into that, which occurred globally in the 90s and early 2000s, to really Indigenous filmmakers embracing genre. You're going to see much more of this coming. Jeff Barnaby's next film is as genre as it gets. Dennis Goulet made a brilliant short film called Awakening, which is a traditional Anishinaabe legend that she set in a post-apocalyptic world. I think this is really the next stage of Indigenous film. The next generation is what we're going to see is more of an adoption of classical cinematic genre and tropes and an inverting of those to tell anti-colonial and Indigenous narratives. Now, I did want to get to the good stuff because that was like the brief history of Indigenous cinema in like 20 minutes or something, whatever that was. I do want to say, though, as we study this, because I've spent now 20 years with these films. And for many, many years I did this without actually looking at how the machinations of how these movies get made, who gets to greenlight these movies, and how these movies actually go into production. And standing here now, though, I actually find this inseparable from the aesthetic that I've actually just described and the evolution that I've just talked about. So it's always key to understand. So if the NFB, for example, is foremost in Indigenous cinema, which it is, the NFB was formed during the potlatch ban in Canada. It was formed at the height of the residential school and the assimilationist policies of the Canadian government. It was an agent of propaganda for the Canadian government. And while it's doing admirable and very good work to acknowledge and reconcile its own history, it is nonetheless a colonial institution built to tell colonial stories. And the process in which Indigenous filmmakers have engaged and had their movies produced there is a complex one. And I think it is important to remember that one of the reasons why issue-based, activist-driven documentaries were the foundation and continuing to be the large mode of production for Indigenous filmmakers is this is what we are allowed to make in Canada. So as much as we can celebrate the evolution would look radically different if we had different modes of funding and if we had different films greenlit at different periods of times. Now, I mentioned, for example, the narrative developments that occurred in Australia and New Zealand in the late 80s and early 90s. Those did not occur in Canada. And the reason is because those stories were still given to non-Indigenous filmmakers in Canada at that time. So if you look at the output of Canadian film, say in the 80s and 90s, you have very good films. You have films like Black Robe, you have films like Clear Cut, which if you don't know that film, it's Graham Greene's favorite movie he ever made. It's awesome. I urge you to see that. You have Dance Me Outside. You have Where the Spirit Lives, which is a TV movie made about residential schools. All of these made by non-Indigenous folks. In the States, you have Dances with Wolves. You have all of these films made by non-Indigenous filmmakers. Non-Indigenous filmmakers were not getting the funding to have these films greenlit under the system in Canada. And so it's important to not divorce the evolution of the cinema with those factors, and that those factors still persist to this day. So they as much guide the evolution, unfortunately, as the artists actually do. And it's quite restrictive. So the difference is that for example, in Australia, they have in the Screen Australia, which is their version of Telefilm, their main funding body, they have had now for more than 20 years an Indigenous office that's there that oversees all Indigenous related production within the funding. They like Canada, which gained APTN and was meant to be a panacea for the production of Indigenous storytelling, and it has done many things that are very positive, but we have not seen an equal obligation fulfilled on the basis of all the other broadcasters in Canada. And this is one of the challenges in New Zealand now faces. There's maybe more than four Maori language television stations in New Zealand. That is where the large scale Maori productions occur. They don't occur outside of those spaces. So, but Film New Zealand, or New Zealand Film, their major funding body, has been largely engaged with the Maori population in a more concrete way than Telefilm has been with the Indigenous population, for example, in Canada. So you've been able to foster films out of New Zealand. Once Were Warriors, Lee Tamahori's film from the from the 90s, Whale Rider, Nikki Caro's film. This is grown filmmakers that have actually gone on to make much larger international productions. Lee Tamahori made a James Bond movie, for goodness sakes. So they've gone on to much larger. We have not seen that in Canada. And it is a result of the funding policies and the decision making around what films actually get funded. And we should note that all of the funding bodies in Canada still suffer from a real lack of Indigenous representation on any level in their organizations. And so while I celebrate all of the evolution, I think it's really important. And the situation, I should say, in the States is much, much worse. where there aren't even public funds for Indigenous filmmakers to actually access. They are entirely market driven. And that is why you see, other than the support of a place like the Sundance Film Festival, which runs a Indigenous film lab, that is where we've actually seen the fostering of Indigenous talent occur in the US. It's been outside of the mainstream system or mainstream film industry. So I do want to make sure that while we acknowledge Canada's significant role in the development of Indigenous cinema, we should also acknowledge its limitations in doing so, and that it has not kept pace, because Asuma is again an outlier that exists in a largely Indigenous-speaking place in the world, where it's more community-based and making films for its own Indigenous audience. So they've had a freedom that Indigenous artists existing in English or French Canada have struggled to actually have the same sort of audience or marketplace for their own films. It's, I think, central to understand the role CAMA played in this. It's why I brought them up. It's because that provided a training ground for an entire generation of Indigenous filmmakers in Australia that now contributes to the remarkable output that we see from Australian filmmakers today. Canada did not do that. So we don't have, while there's an amazing number of Indigenous filmmakers who are coming along and making great films, they have not had the support from the system that a place like CAMA would have actually ultimately provided. It's been harder for them with APTN to get the same sort of breadth. In fact, I would say most broadcasters in Canada have looked at the founding of APTN as an excuse not to make Indigenous programming, but instead allowed that to exist on the Indigenous network, which creates a real gap in getting these stories out. And we face it now in a moment, whether it's the 150th birthday or whatever you want to put to it. I always like to point out that 150 years is roughly 7 generations, give or take. And if you know some Indigenous ideologies and philosophies, 7 generations is very important. So for many of us, it's actually quite clear why this is all happening right now. And it actually doesn't exist in their colonial framework of 150 years. It exists in something of a different framework. But they do interestingly align. But I think what we're seeing now is that there is a larger gap. Now, that's not to say progress hasn't been made. Telefilm has identified funds through the great advocacy of people like Dennis Goulet and Marcia Nickerson, and again, Indigenous women really leading the way in terms of this, advocating for dedicated funds for Indigenous production in Canada. We're going to get that, not a dedicated office, but we're getting there. CBC has identified some funds for diversity filmmaking. All of these are percentage points of the large-scale industrial production that goes on in Canada. And the era of the 90s, where you had largely Indigenous stories being told by non-Indigenous filmmakers, is still the norm on Turtle Island. So there are movies that will be coming out later this year that are Indigenous stories by Indigenous writers that are made by non-Indigenous filmmakers. And I think we can't ignore the fact that Indigenous cinema as being defined partly out of necessity, but partly out of the funding made up, determined by colonial institutions, that we don't have the same level of advancement in the narratives that Indigenous film is associated with activist-based documentaries, which of course is true, but we actually remove it from the context of why that is. And some of it is that was urgent for the filmmakers, and some of it is because that was what was fundable under our system. So, all that to say, what I always advocate for, and I will do this with you folks in hopes that some of this will filter to your classes, is we need to center Indigenous voices in this conversation. We can't continue to make Indigenous stories with non-Indigenous directors and producers and expect the stories to change. The stories will be exactly as they have always been. It is only when we do something different that will actually affect change. So, and that is why, to return to voice, why voice is ultimately so important and centered all of this. It's both the idea of voice, perspective, where the film is coming from, but it's also literally quite physically the voice, which for Indigenous people as has been very evident in the past few weeks, challenges the very structure of a colonial state. Because when Indigenous voices rise up and tell our stories, it counters the large narrative that places like Canada have built for themselves, which is that Indigenous voices don't actually exist, that this place was here for the taking. And so what I encourage is that we normalize, if I can use that loaded term, Indigenous cinema across the canon, that we even though that it presents challenges for canonical adoption, in that it's documentary, many of the filmmakers don't get a chance to make a number of films to be read in an auteurist sort of framework, all those sort of Western ideas of how one becomes canonized. Despite all of that, this is a global movement that has only grown in both of its terms of its production and its sophistication since its birth some 45 years ago. And I think by the very nature of what the films that I know you are going to be seeing, in a culture in Canada where English Canada has long struggled to figure out its own cinematic identity, I might suggest that Canada's cinematic identity has been here all along. If we would only fund it properly, we might be able to get the stories that are most needed right now onto the screen the way they should be.
Thank you for that warm reception. That means there'll be a good question and answer, and I'll start because I get to.
Yeah.
And it is precisely on the issue of voice, not the blooming contemporary issue,
Sure.
unless you want to bring that up. But you mentioned Neese, and she's a remarkable, powerful woman, small in stature, big in scale. To talk to her, you have to lean in because she's so quiet. Mm-hmm. And it's an amazing thing. And I want to kind of map that to Atanasiuit, which similarly forces us to listen.
Yes.
You know, no one's telling us or the characters in the film what's going to happen. You have to listen and observe. And I wonder if you want to maybe just pick that up and see how that idea extended into the more recent films?
Yeah, I mean, Neese's films are all the cinema of listening. And because that is what she does. She will say that is her process, is to listen. What she wants to do is give voice to others. And so she listens, which is listening to Indigenous people on Turtle Island for the colonial states is a new thing. If they even still do it, I'm not sure. There's a lot of resistance against it, but so I think it's revolutionary in terms of why that was so important. I mean, I've learned an immense by listening to her, but also listening to why she valued that voice, why that was so important to her. And of course, as an audience member, when I first saw Incident Restitution in 1984, I was 11. I was a kid who loved cinema because of Star Wars, not because of Indigenous cinema. But when I saw Neese both and her voice in Incident Restitution, it was the first time, maybe outside of a Beachcombers episode, where I had ever seen someone who looked like my grandmother. And it's the simple things sometimes that remind you why representation is so important. But it was in that moment, and I'm not alone. You'll talk to many. Jeff Barnaby has this exact same memory. Many of us have this memory because it aired on CBC, Incident Restitution, famous, or was it TVO? One of the two, and was widely watched and was at the time again revolutionary. To have an Indigenous woman speaking to you was revolutionary in Canadian media. But it also, the experience really opened up my idea of what films could be, and the fact that there could be a cinema about us and for us. Likewise with Atanasiuit, you're right, it does not, I think the brilliance of Zach's films is that they are made not for a colonial audience. They do not care if you get it. because it's not a movie for you in a way that most movies are for you. It's a movie for someone else. And so and I think that is really part of the genius of him, is that he doesn't care if Southerners get it. And he tells stories, his most recent film, The Searchers, which is a remake, and he will acknowledge all of that. He'll also tell you that it's based on a story that did occur in his community, a story that isn't actually spoken about, or hasn't been spoken about until relatively recently. And it is him having heard that story, again, listening, and wanting to make sure that it is not lost. Because again, so much of our stories are told and related in this way. They're not written down. These are oral histories, oral stories. And so to capture them in this way is actually his active resistance against colonialism, against the infringement of the South onto his people. So yeah, I think a lot of these films are very reliant on listening because they are not necessarily there for you. I think Neese makes films that communicate to a multitude of audiences, but Zach does not, and nor should he. And I think that's actually one of the great strengths of the films. And I think he's very clever, because Adon Arjawat, was part of a trilogy, and that story was very purposefully decided to be the first one, because it had Leanian type epic landscapes. It had a lot of cinematic
love
language.
Story and
love stories. There's violence. There's sex. There's all sorts of the stuff everyone loves, and it has a lot of very familiar tropes for a cinema engaged audience. It seems like it's one thing when it's actually something different. And I think all of his films have that element. Is that he is a filmmaker very much in tune with his craft, very much a cinephile, but one who's constantly subverting those expectations for his audience. So whereas Ford loved to cast his characters against a landscape, but at a medium shot, so that he could then encroach to get wane and sort of intense, Zach does the reverse. Zach pulls away from the action in his film. The best scene in the movie, which is a gunfight, is shot in the extreme long shot. So you can't actually see who it is who is shooting. And I think I would tie Asuma as well to CAMA on another thing, which is land-based production. So Asuma is very much of the land of where it is, and Zach's films are all about that, the land. CAMA's is very much located in a indigenous community in Alice Springs, which is a place where you can't help but be very conscious of the land and the landscape around you. This is, again, one of the challenges, I think, for Turtle Island filmmakers is we have not yet had a center or a gathering place on the land outside of Asuma for our communities actually to do this, engage in this cultural practice. There are, some places where you can get close to it, but we haven't actually had a dedicated place where we can have that connection, and where the films and our we can be as connected to that sort of notions. And I think you see the narrative experimentation out of those places is much broader than when you're confined to more colonial structures, both systems, but also literally physical structures.
Yeah, so Rhymes with Young Ghouls, the space is the residential school.
Sure.
So it's a space of horror.
Yeah. But one of the interesting things, what's interesting about Rhymes is that it's a film where I know Jeff had to really fight to make sure that the language was, again, when we talk about listening, the language was not, was maintained. The indigenous language in the film was maintained, because producers can be quite nervous about foreign language. They don't like foreign language. Foreign, they call it foreign. Yeah. I'm speaking the foreign language here today, to be honest with you. I think the struggle, even on a film that is so genre-based, to maintain its indigenous spirit is very real. And these are industrial concerns being pressed on indigenous people. So it's the notions of the indigenous artists having free reign to express themselves is false outside of Neese, who's really the only one who has that privilege in Canada. But yes, in Just Film, the residential school, very present. And that is a film based in his community, based in Listagouche, where he grew up. And I think is very much set in when he would have been a child in that community. So, and when we spoke to Barry Barclay, had a great saying when Naughty was released, and I think it applies to all of Indigenous cinema, which is he said, it's political because it's Maori. And I think for one of the challenges with all Indigenous cinema, even when we make a musical, is that inherently because of our position in relation to the colonial state, our existence is political, and the art we create is inherently political. And while I know there's lots of discussion around identity politics and good and bad, I would always say for Indigenous people, we did not politicize our identity. The state did. The state quite literally passed laws. So if that isn't a political, and laws actually expressly to give them purview over our identities, which is what the Indian Act did. So our films and our art are inherently political, and are political acts in and of themselves, and their existence defies the longer stream, both the colonial narrative that is inherent in cinema, but also the inherent in the state that produced that cinema.
I could keep going, but yes, let's hear from you.
Thanks. I just want to first thank you for this talk, and I completely agree with you that as educators we have an obligation to center Indigenous work. I had a question, and you mentioned a little bit of this, but I was wondering if you could talk more. I know like Imaginative created this report comparing the funding structures in Australia, New Zealand, and Canada, and made all these recommendations, and I was just curious what the response has been, and also given that Telefilm and NFB recently have sort of made some shifts in prioritizing women filmmakers, if you think this is also a moment possibly of opening for Indigenous filmmakers, or if there's been a lot of resistance or what?
I think it is a moment. We're trying to, Dana Scoulay and Marcy Nicholson, all the folks that were involved in the authoring of that great report. We're all advocating very hard. So there has been movement. Again, Telefilm has dedicated funds over a period of time to Indigenous-led productions, meaning Indigenous-owned, and there's criteria that we've built around what that actually means. I would say it's a major accomplishment and a great leap forward. I would say for me it is a fraction of what should be done. I would say the money is probably half or a third of what would seem to me to be about right. I'm also, though, someone who would say, for, say, the National Film Board, the true public creators in the space, National Film Board, CBC, for example, I sort of think the vast majority of their budget should be going to Indigenous storytelling at this point in Canadian history. I actually think that is an obligation, and I think it's whether it's in the TRC report, I think it is actually an obligation of all colonial state institutions in Canada, which is, an obligation around their existence, because the reality is all of this stuff comes from the wealth that came through the oppression of Indigenous people. So whether you are conscious of that, like the existence of even a place like TIFF is incumbent on that history. So I think all of those organizations, and this is making a moral argument, which is difficult when it comes to budgets, as the federal government proves every time, especially when it comes to Indigenous people, that there is an obligation. But the TRC also made very specific demands or suggestions, I prefer demands, to the CBC, APTN, that I think actually should be taken by the larger industry. So I do think it is a moment. We need to push to get as much as we can. I do worry that you're creating systems that might be hard pressed to succeed by the measures by which I think people want to measure them by, and that we're playing catch up in a way that is always going to present real struggles for success, because you're trying to build something anew that should have had some homework done for a few years to actually build up the capacity to get this. I do think we are. I think that initiatives around equality generally benefit Indigenous people. As I said, the representation of women in Indigenous cinema is light years ahead of where it is in the broader cinema landscape. So that's certainly a benefit. But I do think it is fundamentally, we need to do more, especially, again, if the goal, which is certainly my goal, is less about films I'm going to see or the culture that I physically am going to see, and much more about the culture that will be here 150 years from now and what that looks like. And I think we have to keep in mind that the role movies have played to get us to this point. We probably need to make just as many movies from a different place and have just as long exposure to them in order to get onto a somewhat more equitable playing ground. So I would love to see, a vast increase in support for the next 7 generations, and then measure. Someone here can measure that, because I think that's really the ultimate goal. Is I think too often, even in cultural industries, you want to have metrics that are about very immediate gains, and this is not an immediate gain game for Canada. This is about reshaping us and reinventing the culture that has helped create the relationship problem that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have with the colonial state. And I'm not saying that film or culture will solve this for us, but it was a contributing factor to getting us here, and it can be a contributing factor to get us out if we tell different stories from different makers and in a different way than what we've done for the past 150 years. So,
Is there someone else?
You're up.
Okay, I was wondering if you could speak to
how to do, Ezra?
to a third. Thank you for the talk. That's great. A third component that's often overlooked and not discussed, and that's selection.
Yeah.
So, in particular, at Hot Talks this year, non-Indigenous filmmaker opened the festival with an film about Indigenous people,
Sure.
and then in a lot of the media, mainstream media coverage, it was look at all the great Indigenous cinema at Hot Docs this year, and they all led with that film and images from that film. So it kind of took the place, even though it wasn't an Indigenous filmmaker and wouldn't meet the definition that you gave earlier. So I'm wondering if you can talk about the culture and politics of programming and your experience as a programmer, and how to change those institutions as well, because they are doing placement, selection, and rejection.
Yeah, I mean, it's I don't know how specific I'll get around that particular case. I mean, I think curation and programming is challenged because it came up under the same systems that the production side did and the art developed. So again, most of the if we think of most of the major cultural institutions, and let's think beyond moving image, let's think of the museums and the art galleries. The vast majority of those were created during the potlatch ban era. In fact, many of them grew because of the potlatch ban. If we're really honest, in terms of the theft of cultural artifacts and the placement within museums and galleries here in Canada, as well as globally around the world, the potlatch ban was a huge boom to these institutions because it allowed them to take these artifacts in, and now most are engaged in some sort of repatriation or returning these artifacts. And curation then is born in largely that same era. And if if we did a talk around the history of curation, Indigenous art was commodified, but at a craft level, as a primitive art form, for much of the last 100 or so years. It's changed for sure, but it's been a gradual evolutionary change. And there was, again, systemic reasons for that, both in terms of canonization or Western thought or curatorial pedagogies when it comes to visual art, but also functionally as an act of colonial oppression. It meant that Indigenous artists' work was always devalued, so they couldn't actually perform in the same marketplace in the same way that their non-Indigenous counterparts would. So it meant that those artists were impoverished or kept at arm's length to the larger art world. So when it comes to movies, so I still think there's part of that ideology, while we're evolving out of it, and I say evolving because I don't think it just occurs overnight, I think it's a larger process. And again, largely because of the presence of Indigenous curators, if we're to be honest. It hasn't been non-Indigenous. There, of course, were steps to do that, but the growth of Indigenous curation, or people that are now positioning this work, has really helped move beyond that. So when it comes to instances like at Hotbox, I think there's still a vast misunderstanding of what Indigenous film is and what Indigenous art is, right? And it's not the representation of indigeneity that it is what it is. And yes, for telefilm, because this is the way the industry works, you have to make like a point system and blah, 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 blah. What it really comes down to is who is telling the story, and they have to be Indigenous. When Imaginative started, and when I was on the programming committee for Imaginative, producer, writer, director, in terms of authorial control over a film, was how you denoted whether it was Indigenous or not. And this meant that all of those movies made in Canada, for example, in the 90s, all would have are not, and would not have been considered Indigenous, even though many are now presented as such. Likewise, it's been work with the NFB to understand that despite that they are the holder of the largest amount of Indigenous representational content, that work also isn't Indigenous, because it does not come from the community. So I think you have issues of erasure and going on when we have these sorts of decisions made. As I was saying to you sort of before, I mean, for me, I would actually trace those decisions back to the green lighting of the project in the first place, before it ever gets to curators, why the decisions around who gets to make these films are being made and how that works. And it's not to say that non-Indigenous filmmakers, because now we're going into an appropriation place, not to say that those people can't, but it does mean that it won't necessarily be an Indigenous film. And it also does require, in all of this appropriation prize nonsense, the big thing, the sticking point for me has really been, what we're really asking for is effort when it comes down to it. We're actually asking to work maybe a little bit more than you had to previously to tell these stories. That's actually it. And so when I see a lot of these defenses and rhetorical arguments around free speech and freedom of expression, a lot of it reads to me as laziness more than anything else. It's that what you're saying sounds harder than when we used to just steal it. So I'm going to defend us just stealing it, right? But I think there's lots of examples of non-Indigenous people who actually have a great understanding of the obligation that stepping into this world makes, and do put in the effort. And it is, the interesting thing is, Alex is here, as he can tell you about this, the interesting thing is it actually only makes your films better, right? It's one of those things where the journey, and this is tough in the film industry, because again, you're trying to, into what is fundamentally a commercial, market-driven business, trying to express some sort of moral obligation or ethical approach over top, which is always extremely difficult. But the idea that, you may even go down the journey and end up not being able to tell the story, which could happen. I can't lie to the stories are sacred. All of these stories are sacred. And while sacred has many meanings, for us, it's actually for me, it's been made pretty clear what that means, which is that there's obligations, and sometimes these stories are so sacred that maybe only one family has the right to tell them. And you may have to go through, because I hear this all the time about people that have heard a story that's like, this is an incredible story, I got to tell the story. But if only one family can tell it, and that's they're the carrier, as we would say, or the keeper of this story, it's their ancestors have entrusted this story to them, and they can't just let it out. So you may go all the way down and still not be able to tell it. And the struggle that I say for filmmakers is, you actually have to embrace that as part of the good that comes out of this. Because all of this is about education and relearning and reconsidering the relationship, and that is a relationship thing. That comes down fundamentally to how we interact and the notions of equity between the two communities, or the multiple communities. So, this is a very long answer to your question. And I don't want to be dodging the question, because ultimately I think, in isolation, there's a couple things. Both, one, in isolation, there's part of me that says, it's a learning moment. It's not, not the first time this has happened, nor will it be the last. And we shouldn't, there's many merits in the film, of that film we're talking about, B Nation, that for me are very meaningful, which is that, we don't often get moments to celebrate like that as a community, and it's an opportunity for that community to have their moment and be able to tell their story. And sometimes there is a conduit that is required. Do I think there's nuance lost in the telling of that story? Of course. Of course. Are there avenues left unexplored? Sure. All of that. So would it be a radically different story? Absolutely. Might it be better? Don't know. I think when it comes to curation, it's hard to look at one film in isolation. I would look at the sort of totality, and that's where those decisions begin to get called into effect. And likewise, I would love to take that decision up a level to before the movie ever gets made. And when you're looking at all the choices, and this is where I get frustrated, because this isn't 1987, when if you wanted to make a film like that, you'd look out and go, well, there's like 2 Indigenous filmmakers, or 3. There's like Gil, and he's on the West Coast. There's Neese, and she might punch me out. So, oh shucks, I'm just going to make it myself. It isn't 1987. It's 2017. There is a host of Indigenous filmmakers that you could explore and commission to do these pieces. And I think that speaks to a much larger systemic structural problem in the industry that does confound and requires equity measures like numbers are against women. Because if you didn't actually have those measures in a male-dominated industry, what are we holding them to? And I think this speaks to that exact same issue, which is that there aren't enough people in the decision-making spaces in every industry in this country to actually identify these things, which is a failing, ultimately, again, of our education system, because I would have, preferably, all of you should be able to be empowered to understand the history and legacy of what's happened on this land, right? Again, one of the real challenges with these stories is, they were robbed from so many of us, but they were robbed from you as well. And this creates a huge gap in your ability to fully navigate your own existence and your ancestors' existence and your future relations' existence on this land. There's a disconnect there that I think many Canadians are feeling right now. They feel it in a way they haven't felt it before, and maybe it's taken so long. It's taken so long for the settler to settle and suddenly realize they're unsettled. And the reason they're unsettled is because they never communicated or learnt or acknowledged place in themselves. And so many Canadians struggle with being lost on the very land they now call home. They don't communicate with it. The land, nor does the land communicate back to them. Because again, the land, to come back to language, the land is used to listening to different languages on this land, because those are the languages it heard for millennia. Same with the animals. And I think a lot of, I don't like the term settlers, I like newcomers. Because settlers suggest that it was unsettled before, it was very settled. For newcomers is just reconciling, this is the other thing, reconciliation is really not, is not an Indigenous act. It's actually on non-Indigenous folks to reconcile. We're fairly reconciled. We're sort of in tune with I think a lot of us are very much in tune. I think it's the non-Indigenous population that's actually now coming to grips. And I think we need to get better representation across the board. I think that's the that's the sort of instant fix, or the idea behind the instant fix. But the long-term fix is actually a change of ideology and thought and philosophy and the way Canadians ultimately think on the place they're sitting. And that is a long-term thing. And I know I'm confident actually that it will happen, because I think I listen to the land and have an understanding of time, and the land will survive all of us here and all of this and all of that. This is all very temporary things. The land is permanent. And the land has always known that it's Indigenous land. So it understands. It can shrug and decide to go back to that fairly easily. So it's our own privilege and arrogance that actually denies that truth to us, that somehow, again, that we own the land. We don't. The land owns us. That's one of the key tenets that I would impart. But I do think we need to, if we want to shift the ideology or the direction the country is going as a nation, it does involve getting more in connection with the nations that have existed here forever. And I won't put a calendar on it, because our stories say forever, and so I believe our stories, which is forever. So I think on the level of arts funders, but also on the level of government and everything else, we need a fundamental shift in our understanding of our place here, and our relationship to the place here, and our relationship to the history of this place. And that is a long-term goal. So it's not isolated in one film festival. I think those are key, and I certainly nowadays, as quite evidenced in the last few weeks, the ability for the overculture to do these things in isolation is gone. So you can't, whether you support call-out culture or whatever you want to do it, I'm not sure I would relate that to what happens with Indigenous folks, because I think call-out culture is different when your voice has been marginalized for the entire history of, the state. I'm not sure you're calling out necessarily as you are holding people accountable. But there is a paradigm shift, which is that that there is this, that I'm even here, or all of this is evidence of the new era, which is that the state is going to find it impossible to do things that used to be very normal for a colonial state to do, which is ignore us, and you can't. It is now impossible. And those are not tools we created, those are tools we just co-opt and use for our own purposes. So I think, and Indigenous cinema is one of the, this was Neese in many ways was the Indigenous Twitter of like the 80s and 90s. She held the state accountable when there were few others in a position actually to be able to do that. And I think in all Indigenous artists are actively engaged in this. None of these filmmakers would ever say they gave a whit about Westerns or the whole colonial legacy of cinema. But in their practice, they all refute it and counter it. And I think that's important, is that all Indigenous artists are almost by their existence always inherently resisting colonial categorization. So yes, upsetting for the individual film festival, but it's part of a larger discussion, and I always love to focus on the larger thing. In so many of those films nowadays, I find when they go out into the larger world, their connection to community actually becomes apparent in many ways, in terms of how they actually become accepted. I think we've actually, in recent years, we've seen Indigenous stories told by non-Indigenous filmmakers really struggle to find an audience in a way that they used to. And I'm speaking in Canada, less so in the Revenant, I understand. But in Canada, I think they've struggled to do that. And I think a lot of that is because these things ring false now in a way that is more apparent because of this work than it was 20 years ago. I hope that's sort of answered.
Yeah.
Cyrus.
Thank you for your eloquent frankness. It's been amazing. And I wanted to just pick up on a segue of what we just talked about, and to kind of give you a real-world take on it. So I also had a film documentary premiere at Hot Docs this year, along with the film we were talking about. And in the subsequent discussion with CBC, when they picked up that film, they would pick up a story that I wanted to tell because it was the wrong color. So it still exists very much in 2017. Just wanted to put that out there. And so those systems are still in place because, and this is really funny, one of the things that I was told was, those stories, those stories will have to speak to the farmer out west.
Mm.
Right? Like, I got this, and that, I've never heard that one before. I've heard a bunch of things, but that was...
4 quadrants is what
Four quadrants.
they call that in studio land.
So it's kind of like, I have to kind of pinch myself because, I've been making films for 15 years. And so it's kind of like, okay, we're back at square one, and we'll have to work this back up again. So just wanted to say that's, it's still very present, and I understand the parallels here.
Could I just jump in on that, if you
Sure.
don't mind? Just to say, it's amazing because it's at odds with the way we usually talk about media these days as no longer mass, even though a lot of it still is, but that the new forms are more niche-oriented, specialized audiences. So to say that your film doesn't speak to somebody in Saskatchewan is kind of beside the point in the way the rhetoric around media markets work, but
Well,
it's the
I-
difference between the rhetoric and the gatekeeping.
Well,
Yeah, I think you're highlight-
What is a farmer out west? Like,
Well,
what is that?
exactly, yeah.
Who knows? I mean, I don't know. I'd be nervous for my car to break down out there, to be honest. But I was nervous. I was nervous walking to downtown Toronto and with my long hair. Absolutely. I think what you're identifying though, Daryl, is like a disconnect between the whole industry is in an upheaval, right? And so it is very. And we see this even, I was just in the Cannes Film Festival, and people were booing the Netflix logo. They were booing it. Like 4,000 industry people booing Netflix. And you're like, I was cool, like, what planet are you people on? And I think it's because there's a disconnect, because the industry is still clinging to an older model and older metrics of measurement, and a 4-quadrant view, and got to appeal to the square states or the flyover states, which is all the stuff the studios, you ever try to make a studio picture, this is what they'll tell you with, all of which is proven by their own metrics, actually, if they ever looked at them, to be completely false, right? Because, the one that everyone likes to tout is like the Fast and the Furious movies, which are, awful, but hugely successful globally because they have a remarkably diverse cast. Get Out is maybe a more prime example recently of a film completely not a movie made to mess with the overculture audience, and made for another one that yet is presented in a way that everyone embraces it, even if they don't actually understand what that's going on in, which I think a lot of people don't understand what that movie is doing. So yes, and this is because the CBC and all of these places are still very colonial constructed, and not to reuse that frame, but they are constructed in a colonial hierarchical manner. They are not diverse at the uppermost levels of their management or their leadership. Media companies, their tendency has always been to put the diversity measures for talent. So in other words, on camera or behind the mic, but not necessarily in the decision making. Mm-hmm. And this creates a very false image for the audience, because you think that, all this looks diverse, but editorial decisions are not. Commissioning decisions are not. Buying decisions may not be. And I think those are still systemic barriers. Plus, they are clinging to an old, to me, that actually speaks to the CBC and again, I'm someone who's worked at the CBC for 21 years now. They are challenged around some of this thinking. Look at the shows they still produce. Sorry, I mean, take that part out of the video.
Okay.
But believe me, they know. I've told them this. But so I think they're stuck, and it's because the reality is for the industry, and not to take it all back to business, but they haven't figured out how to make the same level of money that they were making under the old model in the new model. and it's terrifying them. They can't figure out what this is. And the danger for them, and particularly actually acute around Indigenous stories, but actually I would say for all marginalized communities, is that the means of creating our own are much more democratized than they used to be. So, what we're seeing, for example, just on the Appropriation Prize, it wasn't mainstream journalism that responded. It was community journalism that responded. It was not they then decided when they saw the blowback, oh, let's continue to just churn out articles about this to move numbers for them. But it was actually people not incentivized by clicks that moved the needle on that debate, right? It wasn't people whose job it was. It's the people whose job it was that actually countered the debate, much, I think, to their own displaying their own inadequacies, not only just as columnists, but actually fundamentally of where the mainstream media is failing so many people right now, is that it's still trying to figure out how to be mass. And its real danger is, Netflix as a disruptor, and I hate that term, but as a disruptor, everyone laughed at Netflix back when they just shipped you VHS tapes or whatever, or DVDs. all the industry would have gone, oh, fat, nothing. Now they boo them at the biggest film festival in the world. And they do that because they missed the train left, and they're all standing on the station and they don't know what to do. And I think the biggest issue with them around this is, what did the Appropriation Prize, and not to keep returning to this, but whatever, I get it. But, what did that say to the community? I think for a lot of us, it said, maybe we don't actually need to engage with these organizations at all anymore. And maybe we're going to circle and create our own thing because we're not convinced that we need that anymore. And I think that's the biggest danger. What was the biggest mistake of those editors? Was exposing to all of us, those Indigenous writers, of the editors we no longer ever have to answer their phone calls for. So when you do these things, and on a large scale, these media organizations do this, they're actually aiding their own obsolescence, right? They're not seeing what's actually happening. This is for years, the industry thought it was ahead of the audience, and in many ways it was. They had such control, especially on the movie business side, when it was pre-streaming, when it was old bricks and mortar theatrical. They had such control over what we saw, how we related to it as an audience. They're now in a place where the audience is actually ahead of all of the institutions usually meant to create it. It's why people like Vice, love them or hate them, have been able to have such success, because they recognize that and go right for that gap and try to fill that. Now they've become in danger of becoming the institution that they're so railed against, but such as the circle of this sort of industry. But that's the big gap, is the audience is way, way ahead. And this is true if you just look at this Indigenous issue, the appropriation, like those editors raised, $3,000 for their prize? The one for Indigenous New Writers Prize is $100,000? What does that say to me? That the audience, that those editors have no idea who their audience is anymore. They're writing for a privileged audience that is all about protection of something that they can't protect anyway. So they are literally the guys yelling at the clouds, these folks now. Because all of this is changing, that writing an article is not too bad. You've missed, again, they've watched the train already left, and now they're trying to wave and catch it down with their articles. And I think this is a really big disconnect that all of these institutions are really facing, and they need to, it's not so much listen to your audience, but understand that the audience is very different than what it used to be, and that you don't, like the farmer that notion is so quaint, as if the farmer doesn't also have Netflix, and isn't also watching,
Actually, they had satellite dishes before.
That's what I mean. Like that farmer,
that
farmer is probably way up on Bollywood cinema. Who knows? We don't know. But the reality is that that's possible in a way that it didn't used to be. And I think the fact that they can't track that. The fact that they haven't figured out how to monetize that, which is the biggest issue. Why do people really hate Netflix? It's because they don't make the money that they used to when they sold their product. It isn't about Netflix as a thing. It's the fact that their business has been disrupted, that they can't make the same amount. As all of this really comes back to greed, and it's fueling poor decisions that are going to make mainstream media further behind the needle in terms of actually having to play. They're already in catch-up mode, and while there's been all this grand praise for journalism in the age of Trump, we shouldn't be fooled. Like that upsurge is also about commerce. They got Trump elected. That was good for the bottom line. Now it turns out that writing horrible articles exposing Trump is good for the bottom line. That's why they are doing it. It's not because they've suddenly remembered why being a journalist is supposed to be noble. They have not. They've just figured out a way to get more clicks. And all of that, though, is an old paradigm, and that is why people are now distrustful of the media. It's why they're looking for alternative sources to this information. It's why citizen journalism is the new era where we are much more engaged in keeping checks on reality in a place where everything can be deemed fake news. So I think what you ran into, unfortunately, is like the dying gasps of an industry desperate to keep its head above water in a pool that is forever going to rise. It's incumbent on the industry. And I used to say when I would give some of these talks is like the movie industry the music industry went through all of this like 20 years ago. Everyone watched it happen. Everyone in the movie business, who were all protected by the amount it cost to download. That's really what protected them from that, was technology at that moment. They all sort of went, oh, that'll never happen to us. And it didn't even have to. They didn't even have to have their stuff stolen. They just had someone to come up and go, your way of presenting it is old school. Your thoughts around who your audience is old. So I'm going to change that. And that's where they lost. And so I think they need new thinking, both in terms of where their stories are coming from, actually mostly about where their stories are coming from. Because the key, my advice to them would be, you want new audience, tell new stories from different people. That's the key. You're all chasing this old phantom audience, which doesn't exist. This is like the Trump who keeps saying we're going to go back to the 50s, when that's quite literally impossible. Even if he had Brundlefly's like pod, it's impossible. Because you can't, right? And so it's the same issue. The biggest thing they should be doing is actually leaping into this void. They should actually be embracing all of this. They should be on the lookout for new storytellers with new stories to tell from new communities to people that they don't even know. And that's the biggest challenge, I think, for all cultural institutions and all cultural institutional leaders in Canada at this moment, is to build institutions that no longer reflect them. That they actually have to build institutions and content that reflects people they may not even ever met. And that's okay. That's the thing. That it is no longer about the centering. And unfortunately, human nature is tough to overcome. But my friend, in time, no worries. And we got all the time in the world. Yeah, we got all the time in the world.